Without further ado, however, I will switch to our closing panel discussion. We are extremely enthusiastic to welcome a number of noted and distinguished journalists, quite literally from around the world, all the way from Australia, Germany, the United States. This panel discussion will be moderated by a very distinguished ufologist, director of the Center for UFO Studies, Mark Rodiger. I'm going to just introduce our panelists. Of course, we're going to kind of pretend there is no break. We're just going to go right into the panel after I introduce our speakers. Many of them, of course, are very well known to the community already, at least in the United States. But in any case, let me begin my introductions. I have to thank Leslie Kean, of course, for sort of helping to organize the members of this panel, of this very distinguished panel. So I thank Leslie very, very much for that. So therefore, I introduce first to our audience Leslie Kean, who is, as many of you know, a very distinguished independent investigative journalist who has been reporting on UFOs in the mainstream for over 2 decades. She is the author of the 2010 New York Times bestseller, UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record, which many of us know, which has been translated into 11 additional languages. Her book was the basis for a History Channel documentary in 2011. In December 2017, Leslie Kean co-authored a groundbreaking story for the front page of the New York Times about a secret Pentagon UFO program, which included two Navy videos that we all, of course, know very well right now. She co-authored a series of additional New York Times stories on UFOs from 2019 through 2022. Kean's journey as a reporter bringing credibility to this taboo subject was profiled in The New Yorker in May of 2021. Kean is a consulting producer of the 2023 5-part documentary series UFOs, Investigating the Unknown, produced by Breakthrough Films for CNN. Due to the unexpected shuttering of CNN's documentary division late last year, the series will premiere on Nat Geo and Hulu on February 13th and 14th, I believe, of this year. So we're excited to see that premiere. Before writing on UFOs, Kean was the plaintiff in the landmark 5-year Freedom of Information Act federal lawsuit against NASA concerning the 1965 crash of an unexplained object in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, settled in her favor. In 2007, she and filmmaker James Fox organized a large Washington, D.C. international press conference on official UFO investigations heard by media around the world. So we welcome Leslie. Our next panelist, Ralph Blumenthal, a distinguished lecturer at Baruch College of the City University of New York and summer journalism instructor at Phillips Exeter Academy, was an award-winning reporter for the New York Times from 1964 to 2009, and has written 7 books on organized crime and cultural history. He led the Times Metro team that won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage of the 1993 truck bombing of the World Trade Center. In 2001, Blumenthal was named a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation to research the progressive career and penal reforms of Warden Louis E. Laws, the man, quote, the man who made Sing, Sing, Sing. The book on Warden Laws, Miracle at Sing Sing, was published by St. Martin's in 2004. During the coronavirus pandemic, he has contributed articles to the Times and other publications, worked from home, on his Baruch Archives blog, and Adventure in Democracy, and given talks on his new book, The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Signs, and the Passion of John Mack. For more than 45 years, Blumenthal led an extensive and illustrious career at the Times as Texas correspondent and Southwest Bureau Chief from 03 to 08, arts and culture news reporter from 94 to 03, investigative and crime reporter from 71 to 94, foreign correspondent in West Germany, South Vietnam, Cambodia, 68 to 71, and Metro and Westchester correspondent 1964 to 68. Blumenthal earned a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2001, a Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism Alumni World Award in 2001, and the Nieman Foundation's Worth Bingham Prize for Distinguished Investigative Reporting on U.S. Air Crashes, 1994. He was named the Towson Harris Media Medalist of the City College Alumni Association in 2012 and inducted into the CCNY Communications Alumni Hall of Fame in May of 2010. Since 2010, he has taught journalism in the high school international summer program at Phillips Exeter in Exeter, New Hampshire. And in 2010 was named a distinguished lecturer at Baruch College, where he taught journalism and currently oversees historic collections in Newman Library Archives. Our next panelist, many of you again know, is George Knapp. Mr. Knapp earned a bachelor's degree in communications from West Georgia College and a master's degree in communications from the University of the Pacific, where he also taught speech and debate and served as director of forensics. George also taught speech at California Polytechnic University, coached the debate team at the University of California, Berkeley, and taught broadcast journalism at UNLV. He moved to Vegas in 1979 and landed a job as a taxi driver. Later, he worked at KLVX TV Channel 10 as part-time studio cameraman and production assistant. KLAS TV hired him in 1981 as a general assignment reporter. George has also co-anchored various newscasts for KLAS TV. Since 1995, George has been the chief reporter on Channel 8's I-Team investigative unit. In that capacity, he has earned 5 regional Edward R. Murrow Awards and 2 national Edward R. Murrow Awards for his investigative stories, and is a 9-time winner of the Associated Press Mark Twain Award for Best News Writing. His investigative reports have been awarded the highest honors in broadcast journalism, including the DuPont Award from Columbia University and the Peabody Award twice. He also won 24 regional Emmys. In 1990, his series about UFOs was selected by the United Press International as Best in the Nation for individual achievement by a journalist. Our next panelist, Mr. Ross Coulthart, is an Australian author, investigative journalist, and filmmaker. He's the author of 6 best-selling books covering truth, true crime, history, and the UFO UAP issue. He is also investigative reporter for the public affairs TV show Spotlight on Australia's #1 TV network, the 7 Network. His latest book is In Plain Sight, an investigation into UFOs and impossible science, published in 2021. An updated new edition of In Plain Sight will be published in the US in August of this year. Ross also co-hosts the Need to Know podcast with fellow author, producer, and journalist Bryce Zabel. Ross has worked as an investigative journalist for over 3 decades in TV and newspapers, including on Australia's Sydney Morning Herald, ABC TV Four Corners, and a Sunday program in 60 Minutes on Channel 9. He has won 5 of Australia's top journalism awards, the Walkley Awards for his investigative journalism, including the top Australian award for journalism, the Gold Walkley. He also won a Logie, Australia's equivalent of the Emmy Awards, for his investigative journalism. He has written 3 war histories, including the international bestseller, The Lost Diggers, story of his discovery of a hitherto hidden collection of photographs of Allied soldiers behind the Somme Valley World War I front lines. His biography of Australia's official first World War historian, Charles Bean, won the 2015 Prime Minister's Literary Award for Australian History. His other books, bestsellers, Dead Man Running and Above the Law, have explored organized crime in outlaw motorcycle gangs. And finally, our last panelist is Andreas Mueller, born in 1976, independent journalist, editor of the German news website of Frontiers in Sciences and Animalistic Research, Grenzwissenschaft Aktuelle.de, and author of several books. The latest, Deutschland's UFO-Akten, was published in late 2021 and compiles all available Herman UFO files on 450 pages. He was the first journalist to discover and report about the UFO files of the German Intelligence Service, BND. He is also an associate member of Professor Hakan Kayal's IFEX Institute. So with that, I welcome all of our panelists, and I turn it over to our distinguished moderator, Dr. Mark Rodiger. Mark.
Right. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Mike?
Yes.
Right. Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello.
Good. Good. Excellent. I'm not going to be on video. I want everybody to see your happy, smiling faces. And welcome all our journalists here, and welcome to everybody. Professor Knuth, in his presentation, showed a slide and a histogram of the 1947 wave of science, which was, of course, incredibly large, incredibly dramatic, and covered extensively by the news media. Because in fact, when we think of the UFO phenomena, what we realize is that, it depended upon the media to tell the public what was happening. Because in the early days, science didn't pay any attention to UFO. The military did. In fact, they did much more so than they said, at least in the States. But otherwise, the public relied on the media to know this, and as time went on, it was true. And of course, it's even true today. It's true in all areas of science, but it's particularly true in an area that is more outre, that has been rejected by the mainstream media, that those pockets of the media that are willing to entertain, talk about, and cover this topic are really essential, because we can only do so much to get the message out. And so I'm really happy to be a part of this and be a moderator for it. And so with no further ado, let's start. And I'm hoping we can have a discussion among the group, as well as, and I'm going to start with a few questions to get the conversation going, and then we'll see where we evolve. So my first question is this: how is covering the UFO UAP topic similar to covering more mainstream topics that you've done in your long careers? And how is it different? In what ways is it different? And, George, I see your face on the screen. So why don't we start with you to handle that question?
Thank you. I've always tried to approach the UFO topic like I would any other story, to be careful, as with any sensitive subject. It's the kind of, we cover sensitive subjects in our ITM unit. So we always have to be careful. And I can recall speaking with my news director back when he gave me the green light to go ahead and pursue this crazy topic from my first UFO news project 34 years ago. And we said to each other, we need to get this right, because if we make a mistake, we could not only damage my personal credibility, but damage our news organization forever. So we proceeded with caution. And I spent a lot of time reading and getting to know the subject matter before I ever put anything on the air. In fact, almost 3 years. I recall saying aloud back then, boy, the more I read, the more I realize this topic is a mess. It is an absolute disaster area. You don't know who to believe or who to trust. What it needs is a good reporter. I should have this all figured out in about 6 months or so. Here it is 34 years later, and I'm still trying to grapple with the basics. The biggest challenge, I think, for journalists in jumping into the UFO topic is the steep learning curve. It is formidable. It's not a simple subject. You can't just jump in and try to report about lights in the sky or things that people saw hovering over their home or some statement by the military. It's so much more complex. How to figure out who to trust? Who's an expert in a topic when there is no expertise, when you don't know what you're dealing with at all in the bottom line? It's no one and it's everyone. No one really knows what's going on, at least not in the civilian sector, and everyone can claim to be a ufologist. There's no requirement. There's no qualification. You just declare yourself to be one and you are. There are no standards, no degrees. I mean, you know, a lot of people who I think claim to have this expert status on the topic tend to have their own agendas. They're not necessarily related to figuring out the mysteries. You have to study a vast range of related topics, things that a math-averse reporter like me, one of the reasons I went into journalism is so I didn't have to deal with math, but you got to know some basics about aeronautics and avionics, image analysis, quantum physics. I mean, the idea of a guy like me reading quantum mechanics books, it's preposterous if you knew, but I've had to do that grudgingly, sludgingly. Archaeological and anthropological records, rock carvings, ancient scrolls. You have to know the history of the phenomena itself. You know, you're dealing with a topic where 90% to 95% of all the incidents and sightings are probably explainable through prosaic means, and yet 9 out of 10 are not reported to anyone at all. You know, the stigma that existed back when I started, it was 1987 when I did my first UFO interview. The stigma was real then, and it is real now, and it is real for journalists. And I think everybody on this panel would admit that we've all had to develop pretty thick skin in dealing with this subject matter, but the stigma exists and it's real. And sometimes, despite how thick our hide gets, it stings. You know, for me, the greatest pushback is not from the public or the military. It's been from fellow journalists who just could not stand that I was taking this seriously and who pillared me on a regular basis and have never stopped ever since. You know, for me, you need to learn the paper trail. There is a paper trail on this topic, and it's really what hooked me. You know, you can't go out as a journalist, you can't go out in the desert and sit there with your camera and expect to get some UFO video. Although I have done that hundreds of times all over the United States at Area 51 and California and Arizona and a place called Skinwalker Ranch. And I've never seen anything that I consider to be genuinely anomalous, but I've tried, you know, and
George, if I can jump in here, I agree with 100%. And I think my biggest complaint with the skeptics is that they haven't done the kind of homework you and I and Leslie have done and others in looking at this, you know, phenomenon seriously. The skeptics are quick with an answer. It's obviously the wrong answer because there is no answer, but you really have to do your homework in this field. And I agree with you. I think that it has to be covered like every other field we cover. And I got into this from, you know, covering the mafia and organized crime and law enforcement. And it's the same kind of reporting. You just have to have your facts right and everybody on the record if you can, and, you know, documentation. So it's just another story, but it's obviously has to be right. And it's more important than ever.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, you're sort of saying the same thing, Ralph. I mean, the difference is that the bar is so much higher when you're covering this story. I mean, you have to apply the same rigor and the same journalistic principles that you would apply to covering anything. But there's different requirements that are asked of you as a reporter. And I've been doing this all freelance, so my situation's different than some of the other panelists. But the bar is so much higher because of the taboo. And this is the taboo that's been applied to this topic for me was completely unique because I covered a lot of stuff before this, and I was mystified by it when I first jumped into this because it seemed so completely irrational to me that there would be this taboo against the topic, and it was part of what motivated me to keep going with it. But that really separates it from, I think, from all the other stories that all of us have covered. And I just want to add too, and the other thing I was always coming up against too as a freelancer was they'd want it to be an op-ed rather than a news story, even though it really was a news story, you know, that kind of thing. But I just want to throw in the mix here too that I think all of you incredibly gifted and award-winning journalists on this panel have continued to, over the years, to cover a lot of other topics. And I'm in this strange situation where since the year 2000, I have literally not written about anything else except the even weirder things that have to do with consciousness and the survival past death. So I may not be the best person to speak to the differences in this because I've been so singularly focused on it for all these years.
If I could add here too, I apologize, Andreas, you go first.
Go ahead, Andreas.
I just wanted to say this is also true with me. And the other obstacle that I was confronted with was the fact that even when I had real good story, so to say, the discovery, for example, of these intelligence files from the German BND. I went even to, I had directly talks with heads of international news agencies, of course, the representatives here in Germany. And the talk went very well. I presented the case and presented everything. And then finally the guy said, well, it's fascinating, but you know, I don't believe in aliens. And I said, well, but that wasn't, there was no talk about aliens in our whole story here. So what? And then he said, yeah, but it's fascinating, and I see that you have everything, but yeah, I personally don't believe in it, and the story never happened to them. So these are the obstacles that I think they are different between if you have something to report from normal topics, so to say. That's the same experience as what my other fellows had as well.
The biggest issue for me, and I can hear what George said, talking about how his news director gave him the clearance to proceed with the story. And that's the key. Because in legacy media, in mainstream media, and newspaper or a television station, I, as a journalist reporter, I'm just a cog in an organization that funds my journalism. I need an editor or an executive producer to say, yes, Ross, you can go out and spend that money and take that time investigating that story. And the big problem in journalism is that the people who are running the media organizations today are acculturated in a taboo, in a stigma surrounding the phenomenon. And they are the people with the management control on the budgets that decide what stories get to go and get investigated. And I had a very pleasant breakthrough with the TV network that I work with in Australia, where I said to them, look, I think UAPs are an important issue. And we did one story and it exploded, just went nuts. And then they realized commercially, as a commercial TV network, there's money in this. The audience is really interested in this subject matter. And then as a result of that coverage, the national newspaper in Australia asked me to do a story, and I talked about the UFO files in our government archives, the story of a guy called Harry Turner, who was a top defense scientist, which is only now being picked up by a lot of people on UAP media. But this guy basically in our government pushed for UFO investigations 50 years ago in the early 1970s. And he described what he asserted as a government scientist in my government was a cover-up by the US government, that they were involved in back engineering, technology, incredible claims. And I reported this on the front page of a national newspaper. And it's interesting because it's all about getting the permission from an editor or an executive producer just to proceed. And I really do think we're at a tipping point at the moment where all of a sudden the mainstream legacy media is starting to realize there's a story here. And it's, Leslie, Ralph and George and others who've been breaking this for so many years, who really deserve the credit for finally getting acknowledged for having broken and tenaciously struggled to tell this story when, frankly, the rest of the world ignored them.
I would add one more thing, is that, we're describing how hard it is to get the okay from editors, as Ross was mentioning, to go ahead with this. Most of the journalism that people here in the US see about UFOs is produced by what you'd call parachute journalists. Some TV reporter gets an assignment for November sweeps, jumps in, interviews the local nutcase who's seen a UFO, gets a debunker to go ahead and describe it and explain it away, and that's it. You got to take your time with this thing and get to learn it, get to know it. And there aren't many places in the country in mainstream journalism where it becomes a beat. It's not allowed. The final thing is the best evidence is in the hands of the US military. And generally, we don't get to see it. We saw that UAP task force report that was made to Congress back in 2021, and 144 cases are studied, 143 are unexplained or genuinely anomalous. We don't get to see the evidence. I mean, some of that is leaked out. But the best evidence is not just videos, it's all the sensor data that comes with those videos that is off limits for us to get unless there's a leak of some sort.
You know, and the beauty of the internet is that all these people now have a publishing platform. I mean, it's the beauty and the downfall, because everybody is a publisher and everybody is an investigative journalist. But some people don't have the background that you have, George, and they, come up with stuff on the internet that is accepted and muddies the waters. So, and on the other hand, we get great tips. I mean, we see stuff on the internet that's amazing, and we check it out and we try to apply our more rigorous standards to that. But it is the Wild West, and you never know when you go on the internet what you're going to find. I mean, the stories that people have are amazing, but then they have to be winnowed down and put in a form that make them credible if they're credible. But we live in an extraordinary age now where all this stuff is available to everybody. And it's like, as someone said, drinking from a fire hose. I mean, you just don't know where to start.
Yeah, here in Germany, we also have the problem that even the so-called UFO communities or so, what you just said, Ralph, when you go into the so-called social networks, which are not so social sometimes, even if you cover a good story and with everything that it's needed, but it is, of course, not an easy story. For example, the other day I saw in a group a posting on some reptile Anunnaki claims that they govern Earth and everything. And immediately it came out at the same time when I brought a story on the German Air Force, if they participate in the American investigations or not. And so those two stories were running along each side, and soon this Reptoroid story got more than 200 likes and was shared by several times. And my story, the serious story, just only had a tenth of these likes and shares. So this is also, it's not always just the media and the politicians as it is here who do neglect the real stories. It's also the so-called community.
And the community can be very unfriendly at times. I mean, Leslie and I found when we were pursuing certain stories, we were tracked by, fellow reporters, not from mainstream reporters, but people on the internet who, were scrambling around to try to figure out who we were talking to, made our work much more difficult. So, it's a difficult environment. I mean, not everybody is interested in the same things, and there's a lot of backbiting and competition and rivalries. So that's unfortunately part of the picture too.
The other thing that I would add as well is that as well as the stigma inside journalism, inside the leadership of media, there is also an issue inside journalism where I've been a national security reporter reporting on terrorism and wars for TV networks in my country for well on 30 years. The way it works is you build up sources, you often get briefings from defense officials or intelligence officials. If you start straying into areas such as UAPs, it's often made very, very clear that it's unwelcome territory. And you see this in America, where if people do ask questions, for example, at the Pentagon press briefings, as has been happening in the last 6 months, which is quite a refreshing thing to see, there's always a giggle. There's always a titter amongst the journalists there. Oh, tee-hee, isn't it funny? This guy's asking questions about UFOs, which is utterly pathetic. I mean, and the thing that I find fascinating is that national security defense correspondents really deserve a kick up the butt, because they've allowed themselves to be misled. They've allowed themselves to be deceived. And whilst journalists don't believe generally in conspiracy theories, it's normally a screw up or it's just something that happens. In this case, I do believe that there has been some deliberate tinkering from the defense and intelligence services to downplay the significance of the whole UAP issue, to stop people from taking an interest. You've got people like Richard Doty, for example, who is best ignored, I think, frankly, a person who admits he's an agent of deliberate disinformation. Why in heaven's name do people take him seriously when he admits that he has lied for his government to deceive people, to deceive journalists? And I think what needs to happen is people need to start addressing the issue of of why it is that people who have rounds, briefs to cover particular areas in national security, why the default position is always to take this issue with a deal of humor and to mock it and ridicule it.
I'd just like to add too, another difficult thing about covering UFOs, and I think that probably applies to all of us, is you were saying earlier, Ross, about, or somebody was saying who you have to, takes a while to, George was saying, takes a while to learn who to trust. So what's happened to me, and I know this has happened to everybody, is that over the years, you develop sources that you trust and you learn a lot of things that you can't talk about. So it's this frustrating situation where, I'll get information from people, quotes, on the inside, or people that have security clearances that can share certain things with me, but I'm not allowed to say them publicly, certainly never use their names, maybe on background, but so you end up knowing more than you're actually allowed to share with the public. And I find that to be a frustrating thing. And you have to be very careful about not crossing a line when people have confided in you with sensitive information that you need to keep confidential. And I feel confident in my ability to do that. But I think it's, it's just something unique about this topic, I think, for all of us who are reporting on it, that you just can't talk about a lot of what you know. And that's normally not what journalists do. They share what they know.
But I mean, Leslie, I think the success we've had with the Times is getting people to talk on the record. And I think that's a challenge for everybody who reports in this field. It's too easy to take stuff on, on background and, without attribution, which defense, correspondents do all the time. But we were held to a very high bar at the New York Times. And everybody in that first story was on the record. And I think almost everybody in all our stories has been named. But that's the problem, to get people to, stand behind their information and be named. And that's very difficult in this field. As you said, I mean, everybody talks on background, don't use my name, I'll tell you this, but that saps a story of its authenticity and its power. So right. We all have this problem, but George and the rest of us have been very successful in getting people to talk on the record and not using stuff that we can't, put a name to.
I'll just add this. I don't know if the general public is aware, or the journalism public is aware of just how big that story that you and Leslie put together in December of 2017 was. It exploded. It changed this topic forever because it appeared in the paper of record. And suddenly, overnight, it was acceptable for other mainstream news organizations to cover this. I can't tell you, I'd been at it for 29 years by that point. And suddenly people are saying, oh, I guess you were right about that stuff, as if they didn't believe me before, but now they did because the Times covered it. And I don't think anyone has an appreciation of what a heavy lift it was for the two of you to get that story on. You look at the history of the New York Times, up until about 1960, they covered UFOs. And then after that, they didn't. They've been hostile to it. And I think that they are probably still hostile to it. If you've seen some of the stories that come out since your article, they've been debunking articles, pre-bunking articles, and they quote unnamed sources, the kind of thing that you could not get away with in your own paper. I think they are inherently hostile, that they walk hand in hand with national security operatives. And the fact that you got that on changed it for all of us, for me and Ross and Andreas and everybody who has an interest in this subject.
Thank you.
Thanks, George. Yeah. You paved the way for that, though. You paved the way for that, George. So you were very involved in a lot of the issues we covered. So your work is greatly appreciated.
I mean, your cutting edge stuff on Skinwater, for example, I mean, that is amazing stuff. And when I talk about, the phenomenon to people, I always go back to the Skinwalker story, because that is the frontier of, where we're headed. And it's just mind boggling.
Well, thanks. I think we were going to talk with Mark Rodiger was going to ask us about the difficulties, what stories were really hard for us to cover. And that would be one for me. You spend some time in this, you think you got your head around the topic. Okay, craft, other planets, maybe other dimensions, something like that. And then Skinwalker comes along. And for the first 7 years that NIDS is there, I'm learning all this crazy stuff that's going on. And presumably it starts with UFOs. That's why Bigelow and his team are drawn to Utah. But I mean, it delves into areas that seemingly have nothing to do with UFOs and are completely weird, off the charts weird. It was incredibly challenging. And I think people figure I made it up a lot of it just made it up.
Well, you know, John Mack came across this too. He started off, you know, with Bud Hopkins, sort of interested in UFOs and alien beings. And then at the end of his life, he drifted off into all these other things like survival of consciousness and crop circles and all these things, which may be related. And, you know, Whitley Strieber says death is part of the mix, that, but it's a much bigger issue. And it goes back to my point before that the skeptics have an answer to everything. And they say, oh, this is, you know, sleep apnea. This is, you know, nightmares. But nothing explains the phenomenon. And the more you look at it, the more complicated it becomes. And it might be interrelated with all these other things, but it's not just, you know, aliens, it's not just craft, but it's so much else. And the more you look into it, and again, the skeptics don't do their homework. They need to at least examine the data before they pop up with all these, you know, glib explanations.
I might add one of the things that I quite often see is I see the whole issue through the perspective of being a member of the Five Eyes, which is something I've reported on. And so I have sources in the UK and Australia and Canada, as well as the US. And the thing that fascinates me is how, as to echo what Leslie was saying, you do often have the situation where you're being told things that you can't talk about. And in my case, I have very senior intelligence and defense officials from my country and other countries telling me that there is a great deal of intelligence sharing between the Five Eyes partners on the issue of UAPs. And yet formally, our parliament has been told by the head of our defense force that they're not interested in UFOs, that this is not an issue that is something that they're directing themselves to. Now, I'm not going to call the head of our government's defense force a liar, but I do think that there's an agenda going on here where I think it suits the intelligence and defense community to talk about these things with terms such as uncorrelated targets or unverified objects, because they don't like admitting. I think at the heart of all of this, there's not really some dark conspiracy. At the heart of all of this, you have a massive defense intelligence infrastructure that just doesn't like admitting they have no bloody idea what this is, and they're as bewildered by it. And the turning point for me in my journalism was I was very much a skeptic. I was doing a report for an equivalent program to the PBS Frontline show for our national broadcaster. And I was sitting in a bar with two extremely senior officials of our Air Force. And one of them leaned across to me and said, "Can I ask, why don't you guys do stories about UFOs?" And I said, "You've got to be kidding." I said, "That's just rubbish. It's BS. Nobody does stories about UFOs." And I was talking from a journalist acculturated in the stigma and the taboo of the subject. And then in the most incredible evening, I was just introduced to pilot after pilot who told me about anomalous sightings that they'd had during their career. And at the end of it all, including one very senior person who went on to be in one of the most senior positions in our defense force. And the thing that really struck me was at the end of the evening, I said to all of them, I said, "Have any of you ever reported these incidents?" And one had. There's such a taboo, such a stigma surrounding this subject. And I find that the most fascinating thing about this, because that's what needs to be broken. Once that stigma is broken.
Now, Ross, I don't know what the rules are in Australia, but officially the Pentagon says they want people to report in Australia. So we've made progress, right?
But not to journalists. But not to journalists.
Not journalists, no.
They should report to Congress or to the committees or so, but unfortunately not. They're not free to talk to journalists.
Oh, true.
I know that what hooked me on the subject was the paper trail. You know, when I started down this road a long time ago, I'm hearing these stories about Area 51, reverse engineering, alien craft, body parts, things of that sort, which is completely wacky and outrageous. Am I going to really go down this road? The reason I was able to go down it is because you start looking at the paper trail. And for decades, the US government, the US military has told the American public, we've got this, we got it covered, we investigated, nothing to it, it's not a threat. That is their official line. And then when FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, becomes the law of the land here in the mid-1970s, agencies that have been asked, have you ever studied this? Do you have any records? had said no, suddenly had to release thousands of pages of this stuff in which it became clear that behind the scenes, they had a much different opinion. What the hell is this flying in our skies? We need to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah,
And I agree. I agree with you, George. That's the issue for me. That was a turning point in my book. I did the archives research, and it's incontrovertible. You go to the CIA reading room library, and there are documents there that refer to the American intelligence services recovering material, objects, discs, craft. Now, the thing that fascinates me is in any other area of journalism, if I found a document which showed a secret program that was recovering some kind of technology, I'd chase that like a dog on a bone. But for some weird reason, because this involves the anomalous phenomenon, weird objects in our skies, whatever they are, it gets ignored. And I mean, Project Moondust, the documents pertaining to Project Moondust inside the archives of your government are absolutely extraordinary. On multiple occasions, there are references to the recovery of disc-shaped objects that appear to be some kind of craft. And it's all being taken back to Wright-Patterson Foreign Technology Division, and it never gets explained.
You know, Ross, one of the things we came across, and I'm not giving away any secrets here, Leslie will probably recall this, is we came across some documents that seem to refer to crash recoveries and materials, and we couldn't authenticate the documents. And in fact, what we heard was the documents were tampered with for reasons that only the government would know. So a lot of the documentation that seems to confirm crash recoveries, et cetera, is a mixture of truth and fiction. And the fiction was put in, we are told, deliberately by people in the government in order to throw adversaries off the track or whatever. But what it makes those documents really difficult to credit. And it's really poisoning these documents, because even if you get what looks like an authentic document of the time with all the right markings or so, in the end, you cannot establish that it's accurate, that it's an authentic document. It could be disinformation. So that really is a problem. And I could also say that of all the stories that were difficult to write, that was the most difficult. I hope Leslie will agree with me that we progressed from, the UFO stories, the first one, December 2017, on the front page, to our last big story, which was on material recoveries, which was a very difficult story to report because a lot of it is classified. People wouldn't go on the record. And the best thing we got was that members of Congress or congressional committees were actually briefed on incidents of crashes in a very roundabout way. And we had a slide, actually several slides from these presentations, which proved that at least, whether or not these crash recoveries are real or what was recovered, at least members of Congress got some briefing on it. Now that we thought was a real breakthrough, and the Times handled it, rather gingerly, I would say, but it did get reported. And that was certainly the most difficult story we ever had to report.
Yeah, we had Eric Davis actually on the record in that story talking about briefings he had given to Department of Defense and and also to an aerospace company with actual dates. So that was pretty spectacular. But I remember, Ralph, it was so frustrating because for one thing, we had a lot more information than they would allow us to include that we thought was really relevant to this topic. And they also buried, so as far as Ralph and I are concerned, we were writing a story about crash retrievals, but we might have a little bit at the beginning about the latest update with the UAP task force or something like that. So they ended up, at least half the story is about the UAP task force, and then buried at the bottom of it is our stuff about this crash retrieval, which is really what the story was all about. We were dealing with an editor who was really uninformed about this. I mean, the frustration that Ralph and I went through was beyond, and that's in that last story, that particular story.
All stories for the New York Times are difficult. I've done
that
stories.
Was the worst, Ralph.
I've done stories that have nothing to do with UAP, and they're also difficult because editors at the Times are, paid to be skeptical, and everything is a heavy lift. That's why it's the New York Times. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's true that this topic in particular encounters skepticism from top editors, and that's why I think what George was saying is that the story was received with some, incredulity and excitement, because the Times is not known for, venturing into areas like this. So in a way, it was good. It kept, the Times, kept the reporting rigorous, and people believed it because it was in the Times. But Leslie's right. I mean, some stories have been very, very difficult.
Well, I mean, for me,
was a game changer. Oh, sorry, again, it's always us. No, go ahead, please, Ross.
No, I just wanted to make the point that it is interesting. I mean, the one thing I look for when I'm a journalist investigating something is contradictions on information flows. And so you've now got a situation where one of the world's top newspapers, because of Ralph and Leslie's story, has basically revealed that members of Congress have been briefed on alleged crash retrievals. And you've got a situation where Ron Moultrie and Scott Bray, two very senior defense officials, have briefed the Congress that, to their knowledge, they're not aware of such incidents.
To their knowledge. To their knowledge.
So what I don't understand is why the Pentagon media rat pack doesn't pick that ball up and run with it. And I think we're at a really interesting tipping point at the moment where I think it's going to slowly become untenable for the issue of UAPs not to at least be a question. And sure, let them have their little titters and let them have their humorous moments as the question gets asked. But I really do think we're at a probative edge now where you guys have actually put the ball on the table and basically said, yep, this is a real issue that Congress is being briefed about. And I've had my own conversations with congressional staffers and politicians in your government who've told me that they are aware of claims that have been made to the Congress involving the recovery of non-human technology, which is just breathtaking.
But, this is covered by classified restrictions, and this is a very difficult area. A lot of this information is classified, and you just can't penetrate. Right. So, you might get somebody, to tell you that, yeah, we briefed on this or that, but getting that in the paper, getting someone on the record, you're absolutely right. But that you're really getting into a very, very difficult area here.
But what's also extraordinary is that it's actually mentioned in the legislation, in the NDAA. There's references to, this Congress that wants to get reports on these topics, and they're actually written there in black and white. So that's a huge thing. That should be a huge story. And, for Ralph and I to go to the Times, it's not enough. But other journalists who have outlets that they work for where they're not freelancers, they're not jumping on this. So I don't know why.
It's really important that folks like us in our profession keep the heat on. And because that story you guys did and the subsequent stories, things that Ross has written and others, I mean, it provided cover for members of Congress. I remember talking to Harry Reid the day after your story was published, and he said his phone was already ringing off the hook. Other members of Congress, former colleagues of his, who were asking, what's the deal on this? There was a real secret program. Are UFOs real? And they wanted briefings. They wanted more information. That led to closed door meetings with Navy aviators and others at Congress. First, it was staff members, then it was elected members. Then it became a really hot ticket item on the Hill. The role of the media in encouraging that it cannot be overstated. And if the media does not continue, mainstream media doesn't continue to cover it, this could go away again, because there's always some other priority for members of Congress, some budget crisis or war in Europe or something like that. Unless we keep on it and make it acceptable for them to go ahead and pursue it, it could go away again. I know that for me, I got pissed off and really hooked on the topic because of the lies. As Ross was mentioning, the fact that our government tells one thing to the public and says something else behind closed doors made me angry. And that continues to this day. We all know it. The kind of statements that come out of the public affairs office at the Pentagon about what's going on, answers to questions or lack of answers to questions, that will continue. And a lot of folks who are there would like this to go away. And the only way to not keep it go away is to keep the heat on.
100%, George. The stuff now about the Chinese balloon has brought up stories that, oh yeah, the Chinese have been, running surveillance aircraft and maybe they're behind the UFOs. So in a way that has given cover to the people who are still trying to explain, these things as Chinese technology, which is ridiculous. But the balloon has given them cause to, trot that out again.
Chinese balloons, Chinese drones, Chinese lanterns, all kind of, there's a theme there.
Right. The Chinese one is the new mogul, George. For those who know Mogul and Roswell.
Yeah.
But let me follow up on your points, if I may. So, because Leslie mentioned how it's odd, or maybe not odd, that those journalists who cover the Pentagon and cover the military and all that aren't really asking hard questions. They're just taking the press releases and the answers in the press conferences and running. How do we think we can get your colleagues to do a better, more vigorous job at covering this?
Let me just say, Mark, that Helene Cooper, who teamed up with us at the Times on the first story, was a tremendous asset because she's a Pentagon correspondent. She still covers the Pentagon, and she brought her Pentagon sources to this story. And if we can get people like, Helene to keep asking the questions and pushing their sources, we'd be a lot further along. But you're absolutely right that the Pentagon, generally the coverage by government reporters on the government beat, the security beat, the Pentagon beat, has not been rigorous enough on this topic.
In Germany, it's the same. There are journalists like me, so I'm not the only one there, who report regularly about the phenomena, but it's not the wide group of journalists who go there and really ask the questions. If they cover the story, they just cover the story based on, as you said, press releases and what's already been known. And there is very little asking, going to the people, going to the politicians here, going to press conferences, writing emails directly to the people who are in charge and not to somebody who's on the lowest level about it. So this is the biggest problem. At the moment here in Germany, many things have changed due to your report in the Times. It's the same here as well. There's a paradigm shift in the way the media report about it. Before that, there was always the giggling factor included. The first thing that we learned about all the published records from England were the most ridiculous reports within all these thousands and not the real serious ones. Now, this has changed also, but this is also just in the wake of your reporting in the Times, with the help of Professor Kayal, who runs the IFIC Institute in the University of Würzburg. His credibility and the university's credibility helped it quite a lot, but still there's a lot to do, and too few journalists and too few politicians here in Germany take this torch, so to say.
But just to reiterate, I mean, it would really only take one news editor on one of the major newspapers or TV networks in America in the legacy media to basically go, you know what, we're going to make a decision to investigate this, to deploy the kind of resources that, say, a New York Times, an LA Times, Wash Post can deploy, or a 60 Minutes. I mean, I've worked on the Australian 60 Minutes, which has unbelievable resources, and we often deployed those resources for the most ludicrous investigative stories. And I can't think of a more meritorious story to investigate than the issue of UAPs. So really all it takes is the psychological adjustment of an editor's attitude to go, you know what, we're going to give this a push. And interestingly enough, I suspect that the legacy media is so afflicted with the stigma and the taboo relating to the phenomenon that I think the only breakthrough is going to come from online. I think what's really interesting about this is the chronic failure, with the exception of the people present and a few others. There's been a chronic failure in legacy media to actually address this issue and to take it seriously. It's allowed itself to be snowed. And I think the breakthroughs are now going to come from new journalism platforms that basically take this issue seriously and start doing investigative journalism. And George is quite right. There are a lot of people that pretend to be investigative journalists that have no understanding of how to weigh facts and how to objectively assess information. But ultimately, that's what needs to happen. And I must say, I do despair sometimes, because you see these news organizations tying themselves up in knots, covering issues to the nth degree on things that, frankly, I don't think deserve the same level of coverage as the UAP issue does.
Yeah, but I think you have to look how far we've come. I mean, we still have a tremendous way to go, but now with the Pentagon officially encouraging members of the service to come forward with stories, with members of Congress asking questions, with these reports, however inadequate, being made to Congress, I think we're moving in the right direction. I mean, it's a long way to go, but I do like to think that things are moving in the right direction.
I agree.
Well, the whistleblower protections that became part of the law that's now in effect, I mean, we all hear the same stories. We've all heard some of the same names, what's going on behind the scenes right now. And there are people who have lined up, have already testified and told some pretty incredible stories to members of Congress. Whether or not that gets out, whether or not there is follow-up to say, go find the goodies, whether it be materials or craft or bodies or the other things that we've all heard about being out there. I mean, I really hope that Congress sticks with it. They now have the information. They're going to get more of it. There are people lined up who've been waiting to see sort of, am I really going to be protected if I come forward? Am I going to face consequences? And, we don't know the answer to that yet, but I hope you're all hearing the same things I am, that there are people stepping up and that there's some pretty amazing testimony has already been delivered.
It's also amazing that in the hearings that some of the people like Gallagher came forward and said those things on public TV. So that can't be, you can't unring that bell. So we'll see.
Maybe should we hear some of people who raised hands?
Sure.
Given the time, that would be great. We've got 2 hands up right now.
So we're ready for questions.
Can you see the hands, Mark?
Yes, I'm unmuting now.
Yes.
Go ahead, Imbar.
Hold on a second.
Hi,
Yeah, 4 hands, right.
can I go ahead?
Yes,
Right, go ahead, Imbar.
Thank you. So I would like to thank everyone for the panelists for the really amazing discussion and also for your work personally. I think that journalists are the only way that this can become a thing and we can advance, as we've seen with the New York Times article, but also other work. And I appreciate also you putting the information on the internet so it's available to everyone. So for example, Mr. Coulthart, thank you for putting it on YouTube so I could see it even though I'm not in Australia. And I wanted to ask about the management control that you raised regarding how it affects you as a journalist and your ability to investigate and put it forth. Something is odd to me. What is odd to me is, as a public member, it always seemed to me that the UFO issue, even if people laugh about it and thinking it's ridiculous, they still found it very interesting. Like, even when I wasn't that engaged with UFOs, when I've opened a newspaper or watched the news, if there was a UFO piece, I would watch it or read it because it's interesting, just because, I don't know. And maybe it's just me and I'm not a sample and it's not, but it always seems to me that the public was always engaged. So it doesn't seem to me like it wasn't known that the public is interested in that, and that's some kind of revelation. Like, clearly now there's proof. I'm not saying that there was the video and now everyone knows that it's engaging. But what baffles me sort of is, why would the management not want to put media pieces about UFOs if it is allegedly, and I don't have proof and evidence, known that the public would like it and then buy newspapers or watch their specific news or the like. Because, for example, like
let me jump in here. You've made your point, and it's a very good point. And you've asked there's a very, very crucial question. The editors of the New York Times story saw how the readership soared, and those videos are among the most popular things the Times ever put on the internet. So the question is, why don't editors react to that? And there's really no answer to that question, because editors have a different opinion than the public. But we have to keep pushing that question, that readers are interested in this. And if readers are interested, editors should be interested. But what you pointed out is absolutely true, that there is no doubt the public is fascinated and they want more information, and editors have their own views, and they have to understand what it is the public really wants on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. But what I want is not just now that the editors understand, like, is there possible there's another motive? I don't know. I'm not doing like a conspiracy thread, but like, what pressures might the editors have as to not to pursue it? Like, why is it a current thing that they're pursuing it? It wasn't like 30 years ago or 40 years ago when there were already interesting stories put forth by Mr. Knapp that garnered all of the attention and people were very engaged with the story. So what stopped it from rolling then?
I think editors are naturally skeptical, and the New York Times editors are particularly skeptical, and they don't want to be, captured by any, shiny object that rolls into view. That's what editors do. But at the end, the question is almost unanswerable. Why don't editors react more positively? I think the stigma is still there. I mean, that's the answer. Stigma is still there. It's maybe less, but. And the higher you go in the establishment media, legacy media, the more reluctant editors are to not just UFO stories, any story you come in with, they have a built-in resistance to until they can satisfy themselves. So that's an ongoing problem. Thank you.
To give an example, one of the issues that I've been covering in the last few years is the miseries of the Iraq War. And we were told, as journalists, as national security defense reporters, that the reason we were going to war in Iraq was to stop Saddam Hussein from having weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons. Now, I can recall talking to people in our defense intelligence services on a very much off the record basis before the Iraq war happened, people gently raising concerns about what the Americans were saying, that there wasn't a unanimity of opinion. And frankly, it was a failure on my part to not have pursued that issue as much as I should have done, because it came out subsequently that the reality was that there weren't any WMDs in Iraq. The whole thing was a complete hustle. And I think the US knew that. And that certainly came out in the subsequent congressional investigations. And I think ultimately what people need to realize is they don't realize just how much major masthead news organizations are dependent on their sources, how much it matters that you get these private briefings from intelligence services. And that, for example, is what was happening prior to the Iraq War. Journalists like myself were being sat down in rooms and being given private briefings by intelligence officials. And you're made to feel very important that you're being given these briefings. And one of the things that I don't think we did enough of was exercising rigorous skepticism about what we were being told. That's the issue.
Professor Shadaghi.
In the interest of getting to a different question, I suggest that we go to Silvano. You've had your hand raised. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm not sure. I'm not getting the video. Okay, yes, allow. So I am. About 3 years ago, I wrote a white paper that I presented to SETI, and I was a NASA scientist, and I had two different experiences with journalism at that time. One is that I became the news. The fact that NASA scientists said that potentially we could have been visited. Basically, that's how they put it, which is not exactly what I said. The second experience where somebody actually came and asked me what I actually said But fundamentally, the first part became the more important one. So many news media picked that up. But the problem is that I was the news and not what I said. And I'm wondering whether you feel that that's in some sense progress, at least it's being talked about, or whether it's not good, essentially, from your point of view.
I personally think that the way of reporting really moved more towards reporting about the facts or an event instead of reporting who said what. I mean, of course, quoting is important, but I think, and I can see how that happened and that it still happens, but from my point of view, with quality journalists, it shouldn't happen this way. Then they should have found a way to even report or write about it in the beginning. So maybe this was just a bad example of.
Yeah, I mean, the point there was that I don't know other NASA scientists who had actually said anything public about it. So that probably was the news for the story. I want to also share the frustration as a scientist, not as a journalist, about knowing that there are secrets somewhere, essentially. You know, the scientists are tired of reinventing the wheel, and knowing that we are wrecking our brains to try and improve things or understand things that potentially are already being understood somewhere else is extremely angering and frustrating.
Well, here's what's worse, is that if there is technology, metamaterials, craft, propulsion systems that exist somewhere that are not understood, that have been studied every couple of years, they bring it out, somebody else takes a look at it, and no one's figured it out yet because it's such a small group that's able to even know about the existence of this stuff. That's the real tragedy. You know, I can recall starting out years ago, going to scientists and asking them, hey, what do you know about this, Mr. Astronomer, Professor this or that? What do you think about UFOs? And they would all say the same thing. Well, you know, I've looked at the evidence, I've read the journal articles, and I don't see much evidence there. Well, what journal articles? You can't get a journal to publish an article about UFO or UAPs. It's almost impossible even now, which is why things like SSE exist as an alternative for a place where a paper by somebody like Hal Puthoff could get published. There are still restrictions on people like you at what they can see and what they can know and where they can publish. Hopefully that's changing.
Right. I mean, the research that is being done is so secret and so compartmentalized and stovepiped in such, special access groups, usually with private contractors. So it's shielded from freedom of information laws that we can't get anywhere near that stuff. I mean, there are very, very few people working on this. And even the president doesn't have, we know, immediate access to this stuff. It's too secret for the president to know about unless he knows enough to ask the right questions. So that's the problem. The work is being done in such hidden, compartmentalized places that no other scientist can get access to that unless he or she is let into that very select group, and that's almost impossible.
Thank you.
All right. Matthew, you've had your hand up a long time.
Yes, I have.
Are you?
Yes, let me
go.
Thank you. I'm Professor Matthew Shadagas. I gave a talk earlier on UAPX, and I just want to say thank you for this very engaging, wonderful panel. First, I have a brief comment that leads into my question, and it ties in with one of the very last comments we just heard, which, as a scientist, it makes me absolutely furious. If there are actually alleged crash parts somewhere, give me one right now. Okay, I'll take it to my lab, do neutron activation analysis, look at the isotopic ratios. Like that's ridiculous. That could settle the debate if that actually exists. And so it's very infuriating. But so I do have then my question related to that is if such things, if such programs and parts actually exist, then were Bray and Moultrie actually committing perjury, or is the trick that you can just brush things into subcontractors? to make them FOIA exempt? Or am I barking up the wrong tree and neither of those is the correct explanation?
I think both are correct. I think Bray and Moultrie, this is what I've been told, and maybe Ralph and Leslie or Ross can add anything to this, is that they did not want a briefing about particular parts of the legacy programs before they appeared before Congress, because they didn't want to have to be forced into a corner to ask questions about it. Whether they got the briefing afterward or not, we don't know. I mean, we've all heard the stories for a long time. Now, we know for sure members of Congress are hearing about this material being placed in the hands of private contractors, aerospace companies, for analysis, stashed away. It's not even clear that we'll ever be able to get it back, even if we wanted to. But there's pretty good testimony being delivered to Congress right now about those legacy programs and where this material might be. Can they get it? I hope so. Should there be a greater examination of these materials by the scientific community? Of course. You're never going to, I don't know that anybody's made the breakthrough on this stuff, but the chances are you're never going to make a breakthrough and figure it out unless you have more resources, more minds put at it and to try to figure it out.
It's funny, I just noticed in the chats too, George, that somebody quite correctly pointed out that Bray and Moultrie confined themselves to speaking on behalf of the UAP task force that had done the investigations inside the Pentagon, and that their comments were confined supposedly to that issue. Now, I'm going to respond to that because I actually don't think that that is an honest representation by Moultrie or Bray. I think they've deliberately left the public with the impression that they were making a categorical statement on behalf of the US government that, to their knowledge, there is no crash retrievals or material recovered. And I don't think the world will forgive those officials if it subsequently comes out that they were playing semantic games. This is too important, and this is where we need to hold them to the fire. This is where journalism can be effective. That essentially, if officials are playing word games, if they really are trying to claim that they're making a semantic distinction between what they know within their UFO investigation task force, setting aside what's known inside the Pentagon and the intelligence community, they're not going to survive public reaction or congressional scrutiny. And this is where I think the paradigm shift is going to occur.
And I think it's up to Congress to hold their feet to the fire, because we've seen that with a few members of Congress already, and others who have the same reactions you do, that they're playing semantic word games, should not let them get away with it. This is live television, and they have to speak up.
Agreed.
Rich Hoffman, can we have Rich's comment?
I just want to say that I applaud every one of you for being the front line of trying to be able to get the story out there. I know that I've been in this like for 59 years now, and I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and that was where of course where Right Pat was with the project. And I remember all the instances where you had basically like, good, honest citizens wanting to report their sighting, and the next thing you know that they're on some sort of a tabloid like, the National Enquirer or whatever like that, which then ends up wrecking their lives. A lot of people that I've talked with in terms of this are very hesitant about wanting to talk about it for that very reason. And I know that, it's also daunting for you to be able to get those stories out and then only to watch the tabloids all pick up your legitimately well done stories, and then suddenly it becomes twisted into something else, and then that goes around the world. We have a real problem with being able to communicate what science is learning and what it is, what we are trying to accomplish here, which is to make it scientific, of getting those messages out. And I would hope that at some point you can help us be that front line to get those stories out. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you.
Mike, do we have time for more questions, or do we?
I think we can
wrap it up. What do you tell me?
Take one more question, and then I have.
We have a list of hands up. Don Soto's had his hand up for 15 minutes now. we should, up to you guys.
I can do another
Yeah,
5 minutes or so, yeah.
Sure.
Right. Well, yes, there's several people. that
I'm
have
free to
their hands
stay
up a
on,
while.
so I can stay on for a while longer.
I'm here.
Me too.
Okay,
Me too.
I had the
All right, thank
opportunity to hear Leslie at AU about 12
right.
years ago.
So sorry, go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to hear Leslie about 12 years ago at AU. That was further incentive to follow her and keep learning. My question is, what do you foresee, just blue skying it, what kind of events, what kind of wedge issues could arise that would break down further the barriers to being closed-minded and closed-mouthed about these issues on the part of government officials especially? What will it take? I think you've mentioned a couple of things here, but any other thoughts about how that can be achieved? What kind of personage or incident would it take for more progress to be made?
Well,
Well, I think yeah, go ahead.
Leslie, go ahead.
No, I was just going to comment on, the thing that everybody sort of has their eyes on is what's going to happen under this whistleblower legislation. So we're going to have, as George has mentioned, people are already giving testimony to Congress and to Arrow. So the big question is how much of that is going to be made public? But I think even if it's not, the information that will be learned as a result of that process can't help but influence officials in the way you're talking about, and will influence other members of Congress, will influence people in the Department of Defense, as more and more is kind of unearthed by these investigators that are supposed to be following up on what they're told by the so-called whistleblowers. They're not all whistleblowers. A lot of them are just witnesses, but nonetheless, they have the opportunity to go digging for information that's prior to this been completely buried because of security clearances, security restrictions that people have. They don't have those anymore. So this could really change things, not only for the people behind the scenes, but hopefully for the public to the extent that we are able to learn about it.
Never underestimate the power of unforeseen events to change the dialogue. I mean, anything can happen anytime that will, throw something new into this mix. So, and now we're at a time when Congress is interested and the media is interested, giving some credibility to this issue. So, if an event should occur that advances this discussion, there'll be much more news attention to it. So, that's always the possibility.
And another possibility, of course, if there's some event that the phenomenon puts on for us.
Saying. Exactly.
Yeah, not just the humans reporting it, but something new that might happen. It's not going to just be, lost like the O'Hare incident was. We're going to have cameras. We're going to have no FAA is going to make up lies about weather phenomenon again. If something really big happens, that's going to change everything.
Yeah, just imagine we would have another Belgian UFO flap. I mean, this was here a real thing that hundreds of witnesses had seen, but at a time where there was not too much cameras around it like we had it today. And also from a scientific point of view, a real big event like a UFO flap, like the one in Belgium, and then a cooperation with even the Belgian Air Force, things like this, that could be, from my point of view, not only a game changer for journalists to report about it, but also for science, with all the gadgets that we have in our hands. And I know that they are more limited than most of us think, but this would be something where we would have hundreds of people filming, reporting, seeing, maybe measuring the same stuff. That, from my point of view, beside this Congress stuff, which is important as well, but could be another game changer. And I think it's in the waiting line. We had those events in the past, and we will have them in the future, and maybe tomorrow.
All right. Dr. Nan has had his hand up for some time. Would you still like to ask a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so yeah. Hello together. Thanks, Mike Siphon, for organizing this fantastic conference and also for gathering this illustrious round of journalists here.
Excuse me for a second, Dr.
First,
Nam.
would like to make a comment.
We don't have a good internet connection.
I think it has become already obvious. Turn the tables where the journalist who should actually have been doing the job. Okay.
There was a bad internet connection. We didn't hear all of that. So just start that again.
Okay. In case you don't hear me and don't see me, I could also just try to type my stuff in the chat.
No,
is it
that's
okay
fine,
now?
right? No.
We hear you fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I try to be as short as possible. I would just would like to say a big thank you to your journalists, because you were the ones who actually did the job and make this thing something responsible for scientific investigation. And you did a better job than the scientists whose job would actually have been to turn the tables, but you did it. So thank you very much. And my question is, it has been mentioned already that now there's this new law that has been affected and whistleblowers can step up and say what they know. But do you really think that some of these whistleblowers or people who know about things will really do that? And will they come up like spontaneously, or will it be a concerted effort? Or and if yes, how can we make sure that this is not another part of kind of a disinformation campaign? How do we know that people tell the truth if they come out now with what they claim to know?
Well, it's always a challenge with this subject to find out who's telling the truth. We're talking about Leslie and Ralph and Ross have all covered the statements that have been made by Dr. Eric Davis, for example, who has told people on the record, I don't know if it's under oath, but in closed door briefings, more than one, that there are crash retrievals, that there's recovered material and craft, and that it's been in the possession of aerospace contractors on behalf of the US military, and then the material has been stashed and studied for a long time with few breakthroughs. Eric didn't get that information just out of the ether. He got it from some high-level people. He was briefed himself, and he wasn't the only one who was briefed. Now, the question is, can it be verified? And I can tell you that there are other people who are coming forward who have already testified that, yeah, what he said is true. Eric is not making public statements anymore. He's got some limitations on what he can say publicly, but other people have stepped forward and told the same story. Now, the question is, will Congress be able to go after that stuff? Will they be able to find it? I think they probably got some pretty good clues about where it's been stashed. Whether it'll still be there when they come looking or knocking on the door, that's a big question. Will it have been moved? Will the people who hold this stuff deny it? It's going to be really interesting how it plays out over the next 1 or 2 years. But the statements that he has made to them, I think, can be verified and are being verified by other witnesses. And boy, you're talking about a game changer. If somebody can get their hands on something, some metamaterial, something that came from somewhere else that was made not by us, that's a game changer right there.
Thanks a lot. That's cool.
And as you are from Germany, Mr. Nam, I can report that following the publication of my book, there have been also here, even if we don't have it on such a huge or big scale like in the Congress or so, but there have been people approaching me who can attribute some things that have been published in those UFO files from Germany. And of course, this is all in progress, but so the situation is similar also in other countries, even if it's not realized to that extent and not too much paid attention to as the Congress and the developments in the United States, who have, of course, a much broader consequence.
Thanks.
Well, Mark
Valentine next.
Mark Valentine, do you want to try next?
Sure. Thank you for letting me comment, and thanks to the panel. Greatly appreciated, admire your work. I was going to ask a more general question about the whistleblower law and how it affects the coverage, but I'm gonna, since it's been talked about recently, I'm gonna ask a more specific question in regard to whistleblowers, and that is, I'm thinking of people, and specifically, I'm thinking of Robert Salas, who's well known in this field, and he commented, I think recently somewhere, that he's been invited in, I guess as a whistleblower, to testify. So I'm thinking of two different kinds of whistleblowers: the kind where their stories have been known or well publicized, and the kind where nobody knows their stories. So in the case of, let's just say, the well publicized people, their stories are out there. They go in and they talk to Congress. And for example, we heard Ronald Moultrie, when he was asked in one of the public hearings, or the public hearing, about the nuclear connection, he just, he said, don't know anything about it. And so, and everybody had, at least I had a chuckle, I'm sure a lot of people did. And so what's going to happen with somebody like Robert Salas, well on the record, lots of experience, goes in and talks to Congress. The media knows that what he knows, and they knows what he probably will tell. Maybe he tells something additional to that. But then how does that affect how the media might cover it, knowing what Congress knows about the topic? And they can't say any longer, I don't know about the nuclear connection. So anyway, it's just, that's a general statement, but also if you want to comment it, particularly Leslie or George. Thank you.
I would say that you're right that somebody like Robert Salas has been talking for years about what happened in the incident he was involved with. But I think once he goes before both the Arrow and the Congress, and they are able to pool reports and testimonies from a lot of other people who had events happen at nuclear bases, then they can consolidate all of that, and it just kind of gives it a level of credibility, and it gives it kind of the official stamp in a way that it hasn't had before. And I think it just elevates it in importance and draws attention to it from within the official world at just a new level. So even if he doesn't have anything new, in their world, it is new. I mean, these people haven't been paying attention, a lot of them, right? So I think it's important that all the people who have, and I know that there are going to be others who have had sightings and events happen to them in connection with nuclear bases, they're going to be testifying to these committees as well. So hopefully there'll just be some kind of report that will come out about all of them, and it's just going to give it a kind of level of credibility and reality within the whole arena of information we have that it hasn't had in the past. I think that's one important thing that could happen with it. I don't know, maybe George, you have something else to say about that.
Well, I think you made a great distinction earlier in saying there are witnesses and there are whistleblowers, and witnesses like Robert Salas have a really important story to tell. The idea that Moultrie has not heard about, oh gosh, what's this? UFOs over nuclear sites is astonishing to me. It's astonishing there's anyone in Washington who hasn't heard about it, because it's been reported so widely for so long. Robert Hastings has written an excellent book, produced a great film. He had his own news conference there in DC at the press club with all these witnesses to tell the story. The idea that Moultrie is unaware of any of this is astonishing, because the original story was investigated and reported by the Washington Post. They had a story in the mid-1970s about the string of incidents along the US-Canadian border. These nuclear missile bases were overflown by unknown UAP. In some cases, nuclear launch codes were messed with. That's a pretty serious matter. If you want to say that UFOs are not a national security matter, that kind of answers that question right there. But I'll tell you this, in addition to the documents that were used as a basis for that Washington Post reporting back then, the OSAP program that was based here in Las Vegas, created by the Defense Intelligence Agency, they put together a pretty thick document about the Northern Tier cases. And eventually it's going to be hard for Congress to pretend that that doesn't exist, or to pretend that they haven't read it. because there is a very distinct paper trail where they looked into it, and that document will become public at some point. I think it boxes in people like Moultrie and makes it a lot harder in the future for them to pretend or feign ignorance. I'd also say this, though, as talking about the whistleblowers trying to go after, give information to go find the goodies. The closer I think Congress and the public get to actually finding that stuff, hard physical evidence, the greater the pushback is likely to be. So, you know, I don't underestimate the power of the Pentagon and some of these contractors to go ahead and muddy the waters in the future.
Thank you.
This is fantastic. And we're almost rounding the bend, but we've got a few more questions. Keep them coming. This is great. Christian, you're up next.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, kudos to that wonderful panel. I think it's the first time that I literally can say that I have books of everybody sitting there and I've read them, which is not very typical in academic contexts. I'm a political scientist, and there is a question that I share and a concern I share with quite some of my colleagues, and they are concerned about the disruptive nature of, you know, like the singularity, the coming out of the news that there is something intelligent which is not us. So I was wondering, we've been before talking about the mechanisms that editors make muting themselves, whether the concern about the consequences, even in the journalistic sphere, in the fourth estate, might be real and might be considerable. And I was wondering if this is something that crosses also your personal careers. I mean, like if you have that, you know, that hard-boiled evidence that can't be contradicted, and you would be the first to shoot the story, you know, and then everything falls apart, the stock markets plunge, the religions tear themselves up, etc., etc. So I was wondering if that is something that concerns you as journalists, and to what extent, or if that could be an explanation to the absence of more stories about that. Thank you so much, and kudos for everything you've done.
I might try and respond to that. I think, look, personally, I don't think that it's a fear by editors or people who are in the management control in journalism that they're worried about the public impact, because that implies a degree of prior knowledge, a degree of consciousness of there actually being a reality. The problem is, frankly, that in most media organizations internationally, the subject of UAPs is treated with utter ridicule. It's the stuff of tinfoil hat nonsense in their view. And this is because there has been, to a large degree, I think, some very, very clever disinformation that has been essentially permeated through the media very, very cleverly by largely the United States intelligence community. I mean, it's a very interesting thing for me as a journalist to have to admit that, yes, I do think that the media has been misled. And I think we've been put off the trail by very clever disinformation. And I think one of the things is that people observed earlier that one of the difficulties, I think it was Leslie, that one of the difficulties with sifting through the information is that often there is nonsense in there, there is rubbish, and that is classic disinformation. I think there are people out there who have actively sought to sow into the UAP research community disinformation, falsehood, that in the hope that it can be published and then eventually discredited. We have in fact been the victims of a very, very clever program of disinformation, and I think that needs to be acknowledged, and that's had the influence that it has had on the way that the media management responds to this with ridicule and negativity.
Well said. But I think the question was how all of us react to the possibility that, if I understood it correctly, that we could bring something into role that crashed our society. And if this was the question as I understood it, I personally am not one of this school of thoughts. I don't think that this will happen. I know it's a hypothesis in sociology that the contact or visiting from aliens, and I'm not personally sure what if UFOs and aliens are connected. I don't think that this will lead to a social collapse. But if we would fear the consequence of reporting journalistic results, which is facts in the end, then we could not report anything of importance. So yeah, but then again, I personally do not follow this school of thought that contact or that the UFO topic will lead to destruction of our society.
I've interviewed some.
Right,
Go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
Leslie.
No, I
No,
was
go ahead.
just, I don't maybe need to go on. I was just going to say that I've interviewed a number of people that I highly respect about this question, even people like Jim Semi Van Halput and others. Not the collapse, but that there will be a certain amount of turmoil that will happen. And others, and then the question of religion, some people believe it really isn't going to affect religion that much because they're already, the dogmas of the religion already include the possibility of extraterrestrial beings elsewhere. Others feel that it will be a real upheaval. It's just amazing to me how different the opinions have been, because I've done a lot of interviews about this very question. And personally, I believe as a reporter that we're moving in the direction of this announcement, this truth coming out. And something as fundamental as a truth as this cannot be withheld from the citizens of this planet. If this is indeed a non-human intelligence, that everybody needs to know that regardless of the risk of some kind of turmoil. And I think any turmoil would be temporary, we would get through it, and then hopefully we would become a new civilization after that. But it's a paradigm shifting truth that we can't hide from the rest of the citizens of this planet, no matter what the consequences might be. That's how I see it.
I agree.
I think that's an excellent spot to close our discussion on that important note. We've extended this quite a bit, which we all appreciate that you stayed with us, our panelists and the attendees. And so I want to thank everybody for that. And then, Mike, before I turn it over to you, a point of privilege as the moderator. When Mike first called me a couple of years ago, I could tell right away that he was the real deal and that he was going to be somebody who could make a difference in the field. And he has, and he's doing it. He has vision, he has drive, he has organizing skills, and he has other things, not just form the society and all the things he's doing and planning to put on this wonderful symposium, which I've enjoyed immensely. I'm sure everybody else has. And so I would like to congratulate him and offer him our virtual round of applause for a job well done. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Well, now I'm going to start crying. My emotions are going to take the best of me. I've met many of you personally. I have discoursed with you and engaged with you. Some hopefully I shall in the future get to engage with you directly. And what I value and what my organization values and what our organization, this is us, right? This is all of us. What this organization values is that personal connection and that spirit of free, open inquiry and dialogue. And I especially right now want to thank our journalists for their time. It was such an amazing discussion. I don't know. We haven't had this kind of discussion. I don't even know where else, but it's such an amazing time. Thank you so much. And if you'll just permit me 10 minutes to sort of bring this symposium, this wonderful tour through all sorts of intellectual traditions, questions, possibilities, evidence, hypotheses, if you'll allow me just 10 minutes to close and thank the people that I have to thank. We have covered a range of perspectives in this symposium this weekend, some competing, others complementary, still others consistent. What perhaps we have learned is that science is that science which, we must admit, still has a rather privileged place in the current hierarchy of knowledge, which is still a human, all too human affair. And if we are to be honest, we must admit that, like human cognition itself, it too operates with filters in place. If it didn't exclude as it reaches out to nature to know her inner designs, then its epistemology would be chaos. The price for authentic knowledge of nature is a patient but vast agnosticism, an openness that recognizes the inherent limitations of human knowledge on the one hand, and the infinite expanse of nature, which is not yet known, on the other. There will always be an outside to scientific cognition, a nether region which suggests that unknown vastness, but which cannot yet be admitted into the inner circle of accepted knowledge. This weekend, we have seen a range of phenomena presented to us. Some of it has managed to enter into scientific cognition because, as a phenomenon, it has managed to enter into the domain of the multi-channel, multimodal, instrumented observation that is the very foundation of any scientific cognition worth that description. Other phenomena, the miraculous, like the powerful example carefully presented to us by our Portuguese colleagues yesterday, mostly remain for science outside the purview of its justifiably constrained cognition. And yet, despite its necessary agnosticism, science suggests, in the face of such phenomena, that as intellectuals, we must admit that these and other such phenomena only suggest to us that we are most likely confronted in these uncanny events by the sheer fact of our profound youthfulness as researchers of the complexities and depths of nature. As scientists and intellectuals, we must, however, listen patiently, quietly, and free of the very dogmatism that stymies true progress in our sciences. But what we have learned, perhaps, is that at the same time, we must be vigilant not only in our agnosticism, but in our willingness to accept that some of the uncanny does manage to move from the incredible to the credible, from the domain of the seemingly miraculous and impossible to the realm not of the ordinary and mundane, but of the truly anomalous. We do not yet know what UAP are because science has not yet, to echo Dr. Misra's important thesis from his excellent talk yesterday, and has not yet amassed a suitably repeatable set of independently verifiable observations whose instrumented provenance is mostly unassailable by the scientific community at large. Although we must note that, as Professor Knuth has pointed out, on Bayesian grounds, there will never be the, quote, smoking gun evidence. This is a very interesting problem in itself. This is precisely where UAPX, the Galileo Project, and the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies enters into the picture dead center. Within these rigorously scientific organizations, not only do we find that patient and receptive openness that is the hallmark of the free spirit of science animating the body of science from its inception. Let us not forget that all real science is pioneering in its overcoming of existing paradigms, what was the scientific revolution after all. But we also find operating within these next generation groups a powerful commitment to careful collection of the data that can be submitted to the rigors of scientific analysis and turned over in fullest democratic transparency to the scientific community at large for independent study and evaluation. Openness of both data and method, transparency of analysis and inference, independent confirmation of results. If we cannot have this, we will never make progress in UAP studies going forward. Despite all of our local differences, I believe that collectively, we academics, professionals, and interested citizens at large gathered here this weekend who care in whatever way about the enigma which is the UAP. I think that we are all in agreement that a scientific engagement of the phenomenon is necessary for progress and advancement in our understanding of what exactly we are dealing with. As complex an answer as that may be, let's not forget the important point made over the course of these lectures this weekend, We are likely dealing not with a single phenomenon, but as Professor Knuth pointed out, a class of phenomena related in ways we cannot yet determine precisely. And yet, our humanist colleagues, myself counted among them, although by no means am I as accomplished as they, have reminded us that while a rigorous and sustained scientific engagement is necessary for progress in understanding the phenomenon, it is by no means on its own sufficient. The missing piece is a larger context of meaning. The humanities provide the foundational challenges that can be offered to the sciences. It is this larger humanistic context of meaning that contributes, I believe, to the larger historical process of paradigm change, perhaps a point missing from Thomas Kuhn's work on the subject, the philosopher of science who has variously been invoked during this symposium. As a consequence, scientific change, and I will hazard a somewhat contentious thesis here, is not itself a strictly rational process, not because science isn't rational, it surely is, but because the very meaning of science itself changes at another level, so that what is and isn't acceptable to a particular scientific paradigm undergoes itself a significant shift in perspective in time. One we might not ourselves be able to clearly perceive if we are caught up in bringing a new paradigm into being. This was a deep point, I believe, noted by Professor Dr. Schwartzel. But this is the nature of paradigm change. From Aristotle to Newton, and then from Newton to Planck to quantum mechanics, we see a series of changes in the very nature of science itself. Although the latter transition from Newton to Planck, it has, I believe, yet to be fully articulated. That process of change is, we should realize, a process that is still unfolding. And so as we engage the UAP Enigma, we too are participating in that change. We challenge UAP with our existing science, and science is in turn challenged by the UAP itself. So we cannot forget that science has always been affected by external factors, a certain context within which its problems, methods, and assumptions are conceived. What we call the humanities has a crucial role in not only providing this context of meaning for science, but it helps science itself come to know that its cognitions do not occur in a vacuum. The sciences must stand together with their humanistic colleagues despite our mutual disagreements or even opposed methodologies. But equally, we must say that humanistic scholars must stand together with their scientific colleagues. This means that we must educate ourselves in these other disciplines. We cannot succumb to the temptations of hyper-specialization that plagues the modern academy. I think this was a powerful subtext of several of our talks this weekend, especially Professor Waters and Dr. Misra's talks. If the humanities want the sciences to be in dialogue with them, then humanistic scholars must learn science. But if the sciences complain of their independence from the humanities, well, the scientists must learn the humanities from the inside as well. Only then will we have mutually beneficial dialogue from which both sides will benefit, often in radically unpredictable ways. This finally is what I have hoped for during this symposium. Not only a conversation about what defines UAP studies going forward and how to think about the core phenomena of the UAP itself, but how we should think about our different approaches to the phenomenon in relation to a discipline that one might not have regarded as important or relevant to one's own preferred approach. I provide the Society for UAP Studies and Limina to the community to serve the purposes of free, open, and mutually beneficial dialogue in UAP studies. Limina in particular is offered to the community for publication of serious, rigorous, empirically responsible research and commentary on UAP as a problem in science and as an object of study in the humanities and in the social sciences. Thank you very much, and I have to thank primarily Enigma Labs for their generous financial support of this entire symposium, all 3 days. This would be Enigma Labs gave us the initial start that we really needed to bring this thing into existence. Second, I want to thank the several private donors whose generous contributions also helped us in achieving our budgetary requirements for this event. Thirdly, I'd like to thank, of course, Mark Hurwitz for his fantastic back-end support. Thank you, Mark. Every time I heard your voice, I felt great. You've got our back.
Thank you. The pleasure's been all mine, I assure you.
Thank you, Mark. It was fantastic. Fourthly, I have to thank Karen Austin of the John E. Mack Institute, who has been tireless in her support of my efforts to organize this event for our serious scholars and professionals concerned with the UAP enigma, especially from an empirically rigorous standpoint. She has provided me with invaluable counsel and even some negotiating skills as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And finally, last but not, of course, least, I have to thank from the bottom of my heart, Vianney Fuentes and the rest of the Fee Fairs team for their inexhaustible enthusiasm and endless assistance to us as we learn the conferencing ropes over these several months. I thank everybody for participating in this symposium. And this is not the only thing that we will do, of course. Please stay tuned. There are plenty of more events that we have planned. There's plenty of more stuff going on at the Society of UAP Studies, more workshops, more engagement. We're planning a series of academic, serious, rigorous academic coursework, follow-up colloquia. A lot of stuff is in the works, so please keep in contact with us. And with that, I bring the symposium officially to a close.
Yay.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Thank you very much.
Yay.